I'm really very happy and very glad to have our brother, Imam Muhammad al-Asi, to join us in this conversation about a new world civilization and the contribution of Islam to this world civilization. Now, I came across his brother through the Islamic Human Rights Commission, and I met him in Granada. And the more I went to in his video, if you look at YouTube and you type his name, you'll find some very interesting videos. But the most thing that fascinated me is that he is doing encyclopedic work on the Quran. So he has published 15 volumes on the Quran, and there are other 30 coming up. So there's quite a work. So we're talking about with somebody who really knows, the subject. So again, thank you very much, brother, for joining me. Maybe you can tell me something about your background, in terms of your life and your history and your thinking.
Okay, sure, absolutely. First, I thank you for the opportunity of participating in your program and the sessions that will follow. And by all means, I can give you a synopsis of my background. I was born in the United States. Went to elementary school in the United States. My father and mother are immigrants to the United States from the Holy Land. And I don't mean the Holy Land, just Palestine. I mean the Holy Land, which is called the Levant, or Bilad Sham. So my father was born in Ottoman Turkey before the First World War, and he immigrated to the U.S. He got married later in life. So my mother came from Lebanon, and we are five siblings. And I went to elementary school here in the United States, in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And then at age 11, my parents decided that they wanted to go back to used to call it the old country. So we moved from the United States as a family. We moved from the United States to Lebanon. And in Lebanon, I attended elementary school, high school, and college. This was during the 1960s up to the early 1970s. In the university, I went to Beirut Arab University, which is an extension of Alexandria University in Egypt. They had a campus in Beirut. So I studied Arabic literature. And anyone familiar with the study of Arabic literature would know that the major is Arabic literature and the minor is Islamic studies, as there is a relationship between the two. During my stay in Lebanon, I was privy to the Islamic trends there in Beirut. And so I used to attend some of their classes and all of this. And then eventually, there's a lot of details here, but there's no room for us to go into them. Eventually, we returned to the United States, and I was in the Air Force, the U.S. Air Force, for my stint, which is 4 years. And then I was stationed all the time after basic training and tech school. All of that was in Texas. I was stationed at Andrews Air Force Base here in the Washington, D.C. suburbs. And then after doing my military service, I went back to the college, the University of Maryland. I got my degree in political science, and then I got married, and then I did my graduate studies in education. I have 4 children, and I was elected as the Imam at the Islamic Center in Washington, D.C. in towards the end of 1982. This was the first election that the Muslims had in the Washington, D.C. area. Before that, the governments used to impose the Imam at the center. But we broke through that governmental stranglehold over the center, actually had an election, the result that resulted in me becoming the Imam of that center. Of course, Saudi Arabia at that time was the head honcho diplomatic mission among the Muslim countries in Washington, D.C. They were very upset that that happened. They don't like the word election. If you mention that to them several times, you might have to take them to the emergency room. So they cut off the postal service center. They cut off the telephone lines to the center. We had to work with alternative means, get a new telephone line, get a new PO box, etc. But anyways, we struggled through that process, and it continued for about a year and a half. After that, the security forces in Washington, D.C., this was during President Reagan's time. The security forces, in conjunction with the State Department and the Saudi embassy, they came and they confiscated basically the Islamic Center in Washington, D.C., and they forced us out. And they went further than that, and they banned me personally from ever going to Mecca and the Medina to perform my major or minor pilgrimages. And I've been one of the founding members of the Forum for Proximity Among Islamic Schools of Thought. That is based in Tehran, the Islamic Republic of Iran, and been attending their annual conferences regularly. And
what is the aim of that center?
The aim of that center is because in the course of the 1400 years since the revelation of the Quran, what developed inside the Islamic context and among Islamic populations were what is called schools of thought. And those schools of thought basically have their own idiosyncrasies, their own differences. So to lessen the purpose of that forum was not to cancel out any school of thought, but to make individuals who belong to these schools of thought. There are basically 5 or 6 Islamic schools of thought still surviving in the Muslim world. So just to build bridges of understanding so that there won't be any area for creating problems and hostilities and eventually wars. You right now you hear the word Sunni Shia a lot, and they want to make a war element out of, oh, these are Muslim Sunnis and those are Muslims, and they never could get along. So we can understand that a war like that happens. There's no basis for having a war among Muslims who are Sunnis or Muslims who are Shiites. except for the misinformation and the alien information that is interjected in some history books and some educational systems, and even in state instruments such as the media. And anyways, so that's I've also been a constant contributor to a monthly Islamic magazine called Crescent International. And I write there with a pseudonym. I don't use my name. And I've been contributing for at least maybe 20, 25 years now to that publication. It used to have a print version to it, but like many other publications, it's strictly electronic now. You can access it on the web at Institute of Contemporary Islamic Thought, ICIT, in which I am a member of that institute. And it's basically based in Toronto, Canada, and South Africa and Pakistan. So after being forced out of the Islamic Center in Washington, D.C., I became the director of an Islamic center in Potomac, Maryland, for many years. And then after that, I began my major, you want to call it intellectual input, working on explaining the meanings of the Holy Quran, a full-fledged exegesis. And that is the first, I say this in a humble sense, it's the first exegesis into the English language. There have been other exegesis. In the Arabic word exegesis, seer. There have been many others in other languages, such as Arabic or Persian or Urdu or Turkish, etc., but not in English. There have been attempts in the past that came to fruition, obviously, in which the translation into the English language was done from Urdu or from Persian or from these other languages. So we do have other exegeses in the English language, but they are not directly from the Quran into English. They are indirectly from the Quran through another language and then into English. So I've worked and finished 14 volumes, and that amounts to about between 1/4 and 1/3 of the Quran. As you can see, it's an encyclopedic type of endeavor. And because our resources are limited, et cetera, it sort of ran into a stumbling block in the past years. And so I had to change gears and go from a high gear to a lower gear. So in the past few years, I've been working on a translation, not an exegesis, a translation of the verses of the Quran into the English language. And it comes out, it's done in 3 stages. The first stage was completed, a full translation. On half of the page, there's the Arabic text, and corresponding to it on the same page is the English text. So you'll find both texts next to each other, translating the verses of the Quran. What distinguishes this translation from other translations is the fact that it is free of Judeo-Christian vocabulary, and it is also free secular idiom. It's unique in that sense. I like to call it a liberation translation. Of course, it's been banned from certain bookstores that I know of, and also certain countries have not approved it to be sold in their own jurisdictions around the world. In the
And
English,
that's in print or digital?
no, it's in print and in digital, both. Um, so the second phase, which I just finished last week and is probably going to be going to the printers in a week or two, depending on how the negotiations of the price wind down. Um, and that is only the English. You will see on the page, you will see no Arabic text. You will only see the English text. And I've improved the choice of words. I've polished the choice of words in the English only translation. And this is meant for an audience that is not Muslim and is English speaking, because there are some words, Islamic words, that are familiar to a Muslim, but they're not familiar to a non-Muslim. So I put in an effort to try sometimes to coin words or develop words that can communicate the original meaning to an English reader without any confusion and with minimal footnotes and minimal endnotes. It's done in a scholarly and academic way because it has an extensive glossary and an extensive index, so that yeah, it works very well for scholars and researchers, etc. And the third phase of this, which hopefully in a couple of months or so, I'll embark on with my editor. I have an editor. I'll embark on a couple of months, and that is I call it a simplified translation. I'm going to try to make this understandable to the younger generation, our teens, our high school students, those who have not a developed vocabulary, et cetera, et cetera. And that I foresee will take some time, but nevertheless, I think it's in demand because I've been hearing a lot of feedback that many people are interested, especially educational systems around the world, are interested in that type of translation. So I think I pretty much, I hope, answered your question. And
Yes.
with a little
Well,
background.
yeah. Well, I bought the 15 volumes of the Exegesis, right? And I saw it's almost impossible for a non-Muslim who has not grown up in this tradition, to read it as if you read any other book. It's impossible, and that's why I'm so glad that you are, able to say let's look at it, because I developed the decolonial theory about knowledge production, and look at how the European Enlightenment dealt with religion and religious questions, and how they then transform and transport the discussions of the European Enlightenment with Christian theology one on one to other religions. While I saw in the way you developed your argument that it's a totally different ball game when take in this case how Islam looks at many questions. And the exegesis was so interesting because you had the Arabic translation, you have the English translation, but then you have the whole explanation of how to look at it. And that is obviously interesting non-Muslims who are not so very well versed in it and need that kind of explanation. So let's thank you for this introduction, and let's move on to the question which the European Enlightenment had to deal with. That is that the European Enlightenment positions itself as a form of knowledge production that needed to um, uh, deal with Christian theology, and Christian theology was positioned as the source. The Bible was the source of knowledge, and the Enlightenment philosophers and scientists then began to argue that in order to understand the world as it is, you don't need to go to the Bible, because the world is governed by laws, by natural laws, by social laws. So the Bible, if you use a criterion of empirical validation, for example, the Bible says God created the universe, and then the astronomers come and say, hey, I have empirical evidence that is not the case, that the creation of the universe can be explained by the laws of nature, right? And because of this contradiction with Christian theology, then they go to all other disciplines of science. Now, and from that, they basically then argue knowledge is secular, needs to be secular. So, in order to understand society, you don't need any metaphysical force to explain it. Now, let me go now into how the question of creation, right? How did Islam, the Quran, deals with these questions?
Yes, that's a very interesting discourse there that we are approaching with your question. Number one, yes, the European history with its Judeo-Christian components has had to deal with the breakaway intellect, the penchant to be logical in the face of what seems either illogical or contradictory. So when this European mind turned serious concerning its Bible, both the Old Testament and the New Testament, and referenced itself around human thoughts, the mind, reasoning, research, investigation, discoveries, it realized that some of the things in the Bible don't make sense. So here we begin to notice a dichotomy in the history and in the character, and then in the policies and the strategies that emanated from what they call the Enlightenment or the Industrial Revolution. The church itself broke into two pieces. One of them remained the Catholic, the papacy in the Vatican, but the other one were the Protestant. I mean, that itself, the protest groups in Germany and Switzerland and Holland and other places in Europe. So I can understand, as a Muslim, I can because as a Muslim, I have the Quran, God's last communique or communication to we, the intelligent beings in this world. That was his last word to us. What distinguishes the Quran from previous holy books or scriptures is the fact that it was maintained exactly word by word, vowel by vowel, sentence by sentence, the way it was revealed when it was revealed. There was no change in it. You can't find the Quran. The Quran is in the Arabic language, the Semitic Arabic language, and you can open any Quran in the world and find the exact verse for all of these 1400 years. Nothing has changed as far as the verses are concerned. The changes that occurred later on were in the human understanding of these verses, but the verses themselves, there were no alterations to them. There is no omission of any of them, as happened in the Judeo-Christian context. So when we understand this, we say, wait, there's something special about this Quran. I mean, and even the Quran itself says that Allah, God, is going to preserve it. We enemies and people who have bad intentions, etc., they may try to, omit a verse in one publication. Something like that happened, I think, many years ago in Kuwait or somewhere, and it was discovered because the Quran is not only preserved in print fashion, it's also preserved by memorization. I dare say millions of Muslims in the world have memorized the Quran. There's no other religious or secular book from cover to cover that has been memorized except the Quran. No other book. And the Quran is like 6,000 plus verses. And it's there. It's preserved in man's memory as well as in the print versions and now electronic versions, etc. So your question is concerning creation. And my reference to that question lies in the verses of the Quran. Number one, we have to be, number one, there are two tracks here. The first track is we have to have confidence in our God-given ability to think, because our thoughts, our whatever developed ideas we have are courtesy of God's blessing to give us the capacity to think. So there's no contradiction with the process of thinking per se. That's one. The other track is the word creation or created or subwords of the same root word. We ourselves don't know what it is. We don't say this because we are sidelining our minds. We are saying this because we are confident of what our minds conclude when we research, when we read, when we investigate, when we try to do our best in understanding things. So anyone, and we had philosophers and scientists, etc., talk about creation as if they know what creation is. Knowing what I know, look, I'm a human being, and there's probably going to be minor gaps in what I say because I acknowledge I'm a human being. But what I'm trying to say here is that creation is an act of divine power. and divine authority. It's not an act of humans, much less a random act. It is a calculated and it is an intended result of super mind, which cannot belong to me or you or any of the humanoids in the world. So when someone comes and says, well, there was a Big Bang theory and it happened such and such millions or billions of years ago, that person is superimposing on the listener or the reader that he knows what creation is. And my rebuttal to that is no one knows what we know about creation, yes, but we don't know what creation is. So
Okay,
I don't want.
may I come in here?
Yeah.
Look, so your response to, let's say, an astronomer, right? Who's saying, look, looking at the Bible says God created the universe in 7 days. 6 days rested the 7 days. Give a time span on it. And then he says, but when we look at the data on astronomical research, it's clear that the universe was created 14 billion years ago. And we calculate this with our mathematics from measurements of radiation, of all kinds of elements in the universe, right? So that's why we say there was no creation of the universe. Okay, here comes my decolonial critique, which is not religious, right? To this argument, and that is you need to explain, and it goes to your question, what is creation? You need to explain how do you create something out of nothing. So there was nothing, and then the question, what is nothing? What is it to say there was nothing and then suddenly where did the Big Bang come from? And here, these astronomers acknowledge that they don't even know. They acknowledge that by saying the laws of nature as we know it didn't function at the Big Bang. How do you know that it didn't function? Because you don't have any empirical proof of it. So here you see that the natural sciences has a limitation in understanding the idea how you get something out of nothing, right? So going back to the Islamic interpretation of creation, or what it is or what it is not, there was in the Christian theology, there was this school that tried to rationalize the existence of God, and that was famously in the proofs, the so-called five proof by Christian theologian Thomas Aquinas, who then put five arguments to prove that God exists, and thus that God is basically the prime mover of everything in the universe. Now, my question is, how did the Quran deal with the notion of how you get something out of nothing, the notion of time? So, how do you argue that there was, let's say, God created the universe in 7 days, said the Bible? What was the Quranic explanation of the creation? So I wonder what is your answer to this?
Yeah, the answer to that is it could be simple and it could be complicated. I'm going to take a middle course. I hope I can take a middle course in answering that. First of all, the Quran says in at least a few verses that, as far as time is concerned, that God created the heavens and the earth. That's the words that are usually used. The heavens, without its metaphysical range, is referring to the cosmos, or to the spheres of outer. He created those, and the earth in 6 days. The Quranic word for it is the normal word day. خلق السماوات والأرض في 6 أيام. He created the spheres of space and the earth in 6 days. That's how it translates. But we can't superimpose our definition of day on the dimensions of existence that we are in. We live in dimensions of time and space. He doesn't. So anyone who wants to say that God created the heavens and the earth in 6 days and then understands the day with human measurements is superimposing a human nature or a human time frame on God, and you can't do that. God is not human. So that's another part of humanizing God. Not only was in Christian history, not only was a human being, an individual, deified, and that was Jesus, but also they've deified other things, and this is one of them. They're trying to deify the creator himself by putting him in the dimensions of our time and space. You can't do that. It's a problem that they can't come to terms with, and it should explain to anyone with a mind of decolonializing the past and the present why all of this intellectual and mental vigor, all of this, and it dared not touch the Quran. Have you ever seen them approach the Quran with the same mind that is so inquisitive about things and seeking fundamental answers to things? Okay, why don't you look at this Quran? Why don't you look at it and speak to me about what it says? And don't tell me what it says with your slanted or your perverted definitions. You come to the Quran understanding it with its own definitions, not yours. So when these verses in the Quran that say God created the cosmos or the multiple cosmoses and the earth in 6 days, the word days here applies to the frame that God is, because God doesn't have a frame, but we're using human language to try to understand something that is not someone or an entity that is not human. So even when we use our language to try to understand God, we always fall short, because our capacity, we are not, if we were gods, then we can understand God, but we are not gods. So we have to acknowledge that we can understand certain things and be satisfied with it, and there are certain other information that come from him that we can partially understand or begin to understand, but not thoroughly or conclusively understand. Those scientists in Europe that were as audacious as to frame God in humanly terms and then disregard him or discard him, they actually, I think, were deifying their own mind. The deity has become that limited capacity in us to think. And like I said at the beginning, this is not taking away from our God-given blessing and bounty of thinking. That is something to be honored, but it is not something that we should brag about or become condescending about, as has been the case with the body of information that emanated from Europe. And there's two bodies of information that, if we're looking at the colonial era, when Europe burst out onto the globe, onto the rest of the continents of the world, they burst out with two packages of information. One of them was strictly material and what quote unquote scientific, and the other one was social. It had nothing to do with manipulating the atom or going out into space or nanotechnology or the rest of this impressive accomplishment just in the hard sciences. But a lot of people, they confuse the hard sciences with the, let's call them ethereal sciences. They confuse them. So and then they become enamored by Europe. Ooh, wow, they went up to the moon, and there are plans to go to Mars. And, look, these inventions that have been done, et cetera, they count. There's a lot of them, and that's fine. That's a possession of humanity. It doesn't belong to Europe. Europe just accumulated the knowledge that was available to it from all parts of the world and worked on it and came up with the industrialization and quote unquote the modernization that we see around us today. But that doesn't mean that those who build those factories are as smart enough as to understand the social sciences.
Okay. Let me come into this. Are there verses in Quran that says God has given you the capacity to think? So because of that, and let's limit it to the natural sciences, to understanding nature, living and that nature, and that God has given you the capacity to discover these laws of nature, which is different from the social sciences, which deals with ethics, how to set up a society, how people live, how set up the economy, political system, etc. That is not the same as discovering rocks and moons. You see, so in my critique of the European Enlightenment is that they put it together. The social sciences, which has a lot of ethics, how to set up a society, is treated as a science like astronomy. But sociology is not astronomy. And the other thing is, the Bible is not, or any religious text, is not a handbook for astronomy or mechanics or so. So you don't approach these books as if they are the replacement of a handbook for mechanics. So my thing is, if you acknowledge that humans have the capacity to think, what does the Quran says about that capacity in terms of how they can discover things, and how does this relate with the knowledge of the Quran?
There are many verses in the Quran that stimulate our God-given potential to think through things.
For
And
example.
yeah, for example, before I go to one example, let me point out that there are 3 words in the Quran that are repeated many other times in the Quran. But those are the 3 root words that you will find them in scores, if not more than 100 verses in the Quran that enlighten us as to how to think. So there are verses that end with لعلكم تتفكرون. The word fikr is the noun, تتفكرون is the verb. And what this is telling us, before the verse ends with the word fikr or يتفكرون or تتفكرون, before the verse ends with that, there are other meanings preceding that. But what the verse is telling us, I am bringing this to your attention so that you may think. As I said, there's multiple areas in the Quran, multiple verses, and if you go to the translation I have, it will help you get to those verses. There's another verse, there's another word that also is found in many, many verses of the Quran, and that is لَعَلَّكُمْ تَعْقِلُونَ. عقل. This means there's a narrative in the verse, and then the verse ends لَعَلَّكُمْ تَعْقِلُونَ, so that you may discipline your thoughts. It's God is not only telling us, I want you to think about this, he's also telling you that I want you to discipline your thoughts about this.
What
So
does it
that,
mean to discipline your thought?
to put it in context,
Okay.
you can't, think about something and then all of a sudden, because you got it right, you developed an ego. That's not disciplining your thought. And then there is another word that ends in quite a few verses in the Quran. لَعَلَّهُمْ يَتَفَقَّهُونَ. Fiqh. And that means so that your knowledge, the acquired information through your thought process, becomes practical. So the Quran is not only telling us, oh, go ahead and think as much as you want, which is required. But as you do that, there has to be a discipline to it, and then there has to be a practicality from it. So in the Quran, when we encounter these verses, and there are many of them, some of them they orient us towards thinking about the universe. Many verses in the Quran, when God speaks about 7 outer spaces, and that's the easiest way I can put the word samawat in the English language. I am avoiding the word heavens because of its metaphysical connotation. So when he's saying, look, observe, monitor this extension in space. And then he says, do you see any discrepancy in it? Is there any discrepancy out there? Which means God is telling us everything that's been constructed in the far reaches of existence as far as we humans are concerned, everything is done with a plan, with a calculation. There's another, these are just some verses that are coming to my mind. There's another verse in the Quran that says, الرحمن علم القرآن خلق الإنسان علمه البيان الشمس والقمر بحسبان. Here it says, skipping the introductory verses, the 3 or 4 of them, it says, الشمس والقمر بحسبان, which means the sun and the moon are functioning with a calculation. And that calculation is not random. There has to be some mastermind to have put the moon in its orbit and put the sun in its orbit and put the rest of the planets in their orbit and put us where we are to make life livable here on Earth. وَالسَّمَاءَ رَفَعَهَا وَوَضَعَ الْمِيزَانَ. Another verse says, the outer space, it is God who has elevated it and placed therein an equilibrium. The simple translations say a balance. He has placed an equilibrium, أَلَّا تَطْغَوْا فِي الْمِيزَانِ, so that you humans do not cause a disruption of this balance, which by extension, God is saying to us, we have the capacity to cause a disruption of this astronomical balance that we live in. We can self-destruct. And he says, don't do that. And there's another verse in the Quran that says, وَأَرْسَلْنَا الرِّيَاحَ لَوَاقِحَ, which means, and that's in reference to him, God alone, we've sent the winds as fertilizer. The word for it is when the male and female parts of a plant come together to produce another plant. I forgot the word, but there's a word in the English language for it. So this verse, remember, it was revealed 1400 years ago, and it's telling us winds act to bring together, if there are trees out there, or there are plants of sorts, to bring together the male and the female organs to regenerate. Pollinate. Yes, that's the word. The verse in the Quran 1400 years ago said that the winds act as pollinators. How could this be? A man in the desert, having a verse like that? And there are so many. There's also an example of one of the pharaohs. One of the pharaohs that was in one of the museums in Paris. One of the pharaohs was dug up in one of the tombs in Egypt back, I think, in the 1960s. And then the Egyptian government invited some scientists to come and look at the mummies of these pharaohs. I mean, these are bodies still there. And one of those individuals discovered that the cells of one of these mummies, pharaoh mummies, the cells are still alive. So he requested further investigation on this mummy of this pharaoh. And I think the Egyptian, if I can remember correctly, gave permission for him to take the mummy to Paris to run some tests and see what's going on. And this scientist, his name is Maurice Bucaille. He wrote a book about the Bible, the Quran, and science. And so when he's exchanging some comments with some Egyptians, they said, well, in the Quran, it tells us that the Pharaoh that died, when the Pharaoh that was pursuing Prophet Moses, when he drowned in the sea, the ayah, the verse in the Quran, it says that we are going to have your body remain as a manifestation of our authoritative power presence in human life. In other words, your body, in one sense, is going to stay alive.
So then you get a confirmation in this discovery of that scientist.
Exactly. And that scientist did not believe. He just showed me the verse, showed me the verse in the Quran. They
Yeah,
went, they showed him the verse, and he himself became a Muslim. He said, how can this be?
yeah. Well, we are already an hour. Time flies. So I want to come to a conclusion. But what I found interesting in what you're saying, in how to judge from a decolonial point of view, the discussion between science and religion, right? So what I take from your argument is this. In the European Enlightenment, they struggled with the fact that the Bible didn't provide them with a framework of how to think and how to study. And now you're telling me the Quran did that. It provides you with a framework of how to think. First of all, you have the freedom to think. While in the Western civilization, uh, the Enlightenment saw the church limiting the freedom of thinking, the burning of scientists, etc. So the fact that in the Quranic tradition, the freedom to think is there, and then it gives you the question of how to think. And in the West, there was no limitation on it. So you could develop a nuclear weapon to destroy humanity, which would be impossible if you would follow the Quranic tradition that says, think, but don't use your think to destroy what
Right.
has been built. So it provides you with ethical guidelines for how to think. And then, if you think and you get insight into how nature functions, and we'll limit it now to natural sciences, that insight doesn't contradict the fact that something has made it possible to exist. It's not a contradiction. If you understand these are the laws of nature, it doesn't mean that the laws of nature doesn't have an origin. You see, that is what I take from you, and where I go back to my critique of the Big Bang, and the confusion basically that they have is how to understand the concept of creation, of something coming out of nothing, of the concept of nothing, and so on. Now, um, so you explained this very very eloquently. Uh, Next time, the next session, I would like to go into social science. What does the Quran teaches us about, let's say, social relations, gender, sexuality, etc.? So, thank you for this session, and I'm really looking forward to the next session.
You're very welcome, and I share your anticipation.
Okay, thank you so much.
You
Okay, let me stop the recording.